All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight, presented by FanDuel here at The Volume. Happy Tuesday, everybody. I'm Jayson Timpf. I appreciate you guys coming to hang out. We are almost to the start of the 2022 NBA Finals, the matchup that I wanted this whole time, the teams that I'm most excited to see faced off, Boston and Golden State. Today in this video, we are going to break down every single element of this series. We're going to talk about the regular season matchups, as much as you can take away from them, since the NBA regular season continues to provide almost no information about what the end of the book is going to be like. We're going to look at both sides of the basketball, what it looks like with Golden State on offense and what it looks like with Boston on offense. And then we're going to look at some series-wide dynamics, some experience factors, and some other elements of the game that I think are going to play a factor in this series. So let's start with the regular season. Now, as is typically the case for teams that are playing across conference lines, they only played twice. Golden State won the early matchup back in 2021, and then Boston won a game in March where Steph got hurt in the second quarter. There were 41 minutes with both Tatum and Steph on the floor together at the same time. In those minutes, Golden State averaged 94 points per 100 possessions, and Boston averaged 109.3 points per 100 possessions. So the regular season stuff doesn't look good for Golden State, but at the same time, it didn't look good for Golden State in the Dallas matchup either, and that ended up meaning absolutely nothing. So I'm not sure what you could take from that. Regular season series was 1-1. I would say for the most part, it doesn't really apply. I tried to watch the tape as much as possible just to look at physical matchups and look at like specific plays. What did it look like when Steph tried to guard Tatum? What did it look like when Marcus Smart tried to guard Steph? You know, like those kinds of things, to try to pick up on those little details. Both teams ran drop coverage for the most part in both games with their big men. So with Kevin Looney or with Rob Williams or with Al Horford. That, you know, again, in the NBA regular season, teams love to run drop because it protects the paint. And if you're going to eat innings in the regular season just to try to get through the 82 games, might as well take away the paint and make teams beat you with the jump shot. So it's pretty typical to see that sort of thing. It's hard to say how much they'll play drop in this playoff series, in this NBA Finals series. But then again, like Boston ran drop almost exclusively against Miami for whatever reason. So it could be a matchup thing, but we're going to get into that here in just a minute. A couple of outlier performances. Andrew Wiggins had a 27-point game in the Tatum matchup. Kevon Looney had 7 offensive rebounds in the 2 games. Offensive rebounding is going to be a really interesting swing factor in the series. Golden State has been a great rebounding team in this playoff run. Boston, not so much. They ranked 3rd out of the 4 conference finalist teams in defensive rebound percentage. They struggled to secure defensive rebounds against both Milwaukee and Miami. That's something I think Golden State will try to exploit. And then Jordan Poole, he had a 29-point game in the game that Steph got hurt. Obviously, Boston blew them out in that game, but Poole demonstrated that he can score against this Boston defense. So that's something that should be encouraging for Golden State fans. Let's start with Golden State on offense. So the number one swing factor, I think, in this matchup is going to be what coverage Boston goes with. You guys know I'm a big believer in switching. As is always the case, when you pick a different coverage, there's a give and a take. So obviously, if you're a proponent of drop, you're going to dislike things about switching, like giving up size mismatches on rebounding opportunities, giving up size mismatches for post-ups or on the perimeter, or a quickness mismatch with a big man guarding a small guard. You're concerned about mismatches in switching situations. That's typical. To me, I just think the pros of switching, the way that it can bait teams into isolation basketball, disrupt their action, make it so that when they run their sets, they don't get open shots. I tend to think that those vastly outweigh the cons in switching, but people have different opinions there. Against Miami, I thought for sure Boston would switch because switching tests your dribble creation, your ability to beat mismatches off the dribble. And Miami only had one guy on the roster who was a good mismatch attacker in Jimmy Butler. So I thought if they did a lot of switching, they'd be able to basically play into Miami's weaknesses and have the most success. I also thought, you know, with guys like Max Strus and Gabe Vincent and Kyle Lowry and Tyler Herro that all love to come flying off of screens with lots of space to elevate and pull up a jump shot, why would you run drop? It allows them to get those looks that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And in spite of all of that, Ime Udoka ran drop the entire series. It was obviously part of the game plan. He was banking that Miami wouldn't shoot well. And to his defense, they didn't shoot well. But I also thought it was Boston's worst defensive series in terms of the numbers that they gave up in the context of the level of talent they were playing. So that's going to be an interesting element. Will they continue to run drop against this Golden State team? And again, and I shared clips on my Twitter feed, you guys can see it there, in both regular season matchups this year against Golden State, Boston ran drop. And so that'll be a really interesting thing to see, because I would think that baiting Steph and Jordan Poole into isolation situations, which, yeah, they're going to take your bigs and they're going to beat them off the dribble. But in terms of the physical wear and tear it takes to try to convince those guys to repeatedly put their head down and go to the rim, I like that as a game plan option better than the idea of dropping. But I'm really curious to see what they do. If they play drop, I expect guys like Steph and Jordan Poole to burn them and Klay Thompson to burn them. So I'm really, really curious to see which defensive strategy Boston goes with. We will know a lot more after game one in that department. In game one in particular, I think we're going to see a really interesting dynamic, because there's two elements, or an element that either team is going to have to face that's going to be very, very different than what they've faced in previous series with Golden State on offense. So I've talked about this before with you guys, adjusting to length and athleticism. I thought this was a huge thing that hurt Dallas early in the season, or early in the series against Phoenix, the reason why they fell down 2-0, in my opinion. When you go from playing against a certain level of defensive personnel to an entirely different level of defensive personnel, a ton more length, a ton more athleticism, there's usually an adjustment period as you get used to the different habits that you have to succeed against that kind of length and athleticism. I've told this story on the show before, but like, I played at the college level, I was a good basketball player, but I play against amateurs now. But almost every summer, a bunch of pros and college players come back into town, and that's when I get with those guys and I work out with them and I play with them. Almost every time there's an adjustment for me, just getting used to the increased length and athleticism. It's just, that post-entry pass that you made, maybe you need to make a pass fake first this time. What you perceive to be an opening in a passing lane might not be an opening against a better athlete. There's an adjustment period there. So Golden State is going to have to adjust to the massively better defensive personnel that Boston has compared to Dallas. The flip side of that is Golden State's movement. Boston has played pretty traditional offensive machines to this point. Brooklyn and Miami and Milwaukee all ran a lot of high pick and roll. It's a lot of isolation. It's a lot of the same stuff that they've seen at every single level against the other 28 teams in the league. Against Golden State, their offense doesn't resemble anything that anybody else does. This is a huge part of why Golden State is always so good at the beginning of series. There's an adjustment period to adjust to the way they run their offense. It just doesn't look like anything else that you see, and you can get caught off guard. The types of switches and coverages that you run against a traditional offense don't look the same as they do against Golden State. So in game one, it's going to be an interesting battle. Who's going to adjust quicker? Will Golden State adjust to Boston's length and athleticism on defense quicker? Or will Boston adjust to Golden State's motion and movement and off-ball threat quicker? That's going to be the swing factor in game one. Against drop coverage, if Boston goes with drop, a huge part's going to be how much contact is Golden State allowed to get away with on these screens, because Golden State does set a lot of moving screens, just like everybody else in the league. So it's not a slander in that regard, but they do set a lot of moving screens. If they are allowed to, Boston players will get caught on screens. Guys will get open looks. If that's held a little bit more, by the book, by the refs, that gives Boston a huge advantage chasing guys over the top of screens. So that'll be an interesting dynamic there. Against the switch, as is always the case, you guys, Golden State's going to get a certain amount of open dunks and layups against Boston's switching defense, just because of how confusing it could be to track everybody. Just because of how confusing it can be when there's three players in an action, or when you get Steph, Klay, and Jordan Poole in an action and everybody panics and accidentally chases the wrong guy. They're going to get a certain amount of stuff out of that. However, there will be a considerable amount of possessions where when Boston switches, it baits Boston or Golden State into a situation where Steph or Jordan Poole has the ball against a matchup that they like, and they have to do something. And for both teams, because we're going to talk about this with Boston in a second, it's just vitally important that you get dribble penetration and you engage help defenders so that you can get the defense in rotation and not fall into the trap of pull-up off the dribble isolation jump shots, which stagnate you and get your teammates out of rhythm. That's going to be for both teams. When they're in those switching environments, both teams have to get persistent rim pressure. All right, let's move forward to Boston on offense. So once again, Golden State ran drop in the regular season in this matchup with Kevon Looney. I'm really curious to see what they do because Miami ran a lot of drop in the regular season with Bam Adebayo, but then they did a lot more switching against Boston. I think switching is a genius defense to run against Boston because it tests their decision-making, because it puts the onus on Tatum and Brown and Smart to not play the game they want to play, which is to get into their bag and mix people up, but rather get them to really focus on having to get dribble penetration. And more often than not, they don't do that. They get stagnant and they have issues. So I think it's going to be really important for Golden State to take a note from Miami's book. A lot of switching, a lot of zone, just like they did against Dallas, to mix things up, make things complicated. They ran a lot of zone in their second matchup against Boston this year, again, because Draymond Green was out, but I expect to see a lot of zone as well. But that switching instead of dropping as much as possible, and then the classic Steve Kerr mixing up coverages, I think is going to go a long way. Now, against switching, what did Boston do against Miami? They relentlessly attacked Max Strus. They relentlessly attacked Tyler Herro when he was healthy and Gabe Vincent. They will do the same thing against Jordan Poole and Steph. Now, here's the thing. I said the same thing about the Dallas Mavericks, but Dallas was unable to consistently attack Steph and Jordan Poole because Steve Kerr had an easy fix: hedge and recover. He would just have Steph or Jordan or whoever it was, when their man would come set a screen, they would hedge, which would force Luka to retreat back to half court to get around the hedge, which would give Andrew Wiggins time to recover below the screen and get back to Luka. Here's the thing. Luka's very methodical with that sort of thing. Boston's slashers are an entirely different type of rim pressure. You're going to see a lot of Tatum and Brown attacking quickly against those hedges, and it works. I saw Jimmy Butler in Miami do this to Boston a lot. They would try to hedge with Derek White on these kinds of actions, and Jimmy would try to beat the hedge by attacking quickly, and he got a lot of straight line drives and great rim pressure from that sort of thing. So for Boston, when they get into those switching situations, they're going to have to persistently attack Steph and persistently attack Jordan Poole and get into the rim. The advantage of having multiple players that can drive, unlike Dallas, is going to be one of their angles that they can go to. With Dallas, you had to get them switched onto Luka or get them switched onto Jalen Brunson in order to attack them. Golden State wasn't allowing the switch. Boston, they have the luxury of like, hey, we'll just throw it over to Marcus Smart because Steph or Jordan's going to have to guard one of those guys because the bigger wings are going to be guarding Tatum and Brown. And so they might, or another guy's like Derek White. If you can just swing the ball to Derek White and he's already on Steph, if those guys can get consistent dribble penetration against them, that will be a huge help. But once again, for Boston, just like with Golden State, against the switches, have to get dribble penetration and engage help defenders and not fall into isolation basketball. So those are the dynamics on either side of the ball. A couple of series-wide dynamics really quick. We just talked about this a minute ago, but in Game 1, I'm really curious to see if Boston, in a good defensive groove coming out of that Miami series, throws Golden State off with their length and athleticism. Once again, Golden State, only a 94 offensive rating with Steph on the floor this year with Tatum on the floor. I mentioned this earlier. They killed Denver on offense. They killed the Grizzlies with Ja on offense, and they killed the Dallas Mavericks on offense. But against Memphis, without Ja, they only averaged about 104 points per 100 possessions. So they have shown a tendency to get stagnant and to have some offensive issues against great defense. In Game 1, I'm really curious to see if Boston can leverage that because that's their best chance to win the series. I'm picking Golden State. I'm picking them in 7 games. I think this is going to be a long series, but I think Golden State is the more trustworthy team, which makes them the better basketball team because execution and attention to detail is all part of what makes a good basketball team, and Golden State is simply better in those areas. Game 1 will be Boston's best chance. If they can steal Game 1 because Golden State struggles to adapt to the defense that they bring, That will be their best chance to then try to close the series out in 6. But once again, that dynamic goes both ways. Golden State is a very different type of offensive approach. It's very different than anything Boston has seen so far in this playoff run. If they catch Boston off guard and they end up going up 2-0 in this series, I don't think that's something Boston can recover from. So game 1 is going to be an interesting thing. 2 other quick notes. Crunch time. Once again, a huge part of what makes a good basketball team, the ability to close games. Boston has played 28 clutch minutes this year in the playoffs. Remember, playoffs, it's within 5 minutes of the end of the game, within 5 points, okay? Boston has played 28 clutch minutes. Golden State's played 30 clutch minutes. Golden State, plus 12 net rating in clutch time. Boston, minus 1.5. Boston has not been a good execution team down the stretch of games. Golden State has been a great execution team down the stretch of games. In a very close series that's likely to have some close games, that's a big advantage towards Golden State. And last but not least, I think Steph's the best player. Tatum's been very good. It's been a meteoric rise for him this year. I said this on the show the other day, and I sincerely mean it. I think Giannis is on a tier by himself atop the league, but I think Steph has the best case for number 2. He had a really bad regular season. His percentages were way down from when he was in his prime. There was definitely something weird going on there, but in this playoff run, Steph has been the best player in this field remaining, obviously not counting Giannis. So I think that's another big advantage towards towards Golden State. Boston might actually be the more talented team in terms of two-way players, but I think Golden State's a better basketball team in their attention to detail, and it shows up in things like what they do in crunch time and just their overall consistent effort and focus. Then Steph is the best player. So in this very close series, I'm leaning Golden State in 7 to get their 4th championship of this era on their home floor at Chase Center. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. As always, I sincerely appreciate your support. Very much looking forward to Game 1 on Thursday. Plus, we have something very special planned for after the game. Stay tuned to the Volumes YouTube channel right after the final buzzer for Game 1 on Thursday.